We're here at the finish line for Jordan B. Peterson's 12 Rules for Life and Antidote to Chaos. Sadly, not as many Chaos Dragons as I'd expected, but so it goes. Let's wrap up this series so I can put it away with a pretty little bow and never think about any of this ever again. This video made possible thanks to the continuing support of viewers, patrons, and PayPal pals like you. Thanks! Hi! Welcome back to the channel! And super welcome back to the last video of this series, the cognitive psychologist's take on this book. Since this video is a wrap-up of the full series, I'm not going to be doing the book me experiment camera angle thing, so no need for a refresher there. Instead, we're going to pull out some quantitative-ish sort of trivia things for the different book chapters, do a classic YouTuber ranking of those different chapters, before closing out the series with one last life messages, either from the book or in response to the advice from the book. And this is all going to be terribly subjective, so if you don't like the way I scored things or my ranking, feel free to make your own. And yeah, let's get this lobster party started. I like numbers. In prepping for this video, I went back through my scripts and the book and made a spreadsheet of the things we encountered along the way, like the number of citations needed flags, doom spirals, and so forth. This isn't the only thing that's going into the ranking, but it is factoring in a little bit. Plus, this was a way for me to go back and remind myself what we talked about along the way. One thing to keep in mind with this is I didn't really settle into a standard way of talking about the source material and the references and all of it until we were roughly halfway through the rules, so the counts might be biased kind of higher towards the end of the book. But a complication in this is some chapters just didn't take as long to get through as others. Rules 11 and 12 are a perfect example of this. Rule 11 took 6 videos to get through, while Rule 12 we were able to do in 1. I played with a couple different ways to try and normalize the counts based on where it was in the series, the script length, the video length, all of these different things, but none of them really seemed to do what I wanted, so my many pages of tallies are somewhat for naught. There's still stuff we can talk about though. For each of these, I'll start with the lowest scores to give you an idea of what the bottom score looks like before going into the top 3. Let's go through some of the more notable things, starting with the positives. We'll begin with points where I explicitly agreed in the script with what Peterson was saying. The overture has no agreement points because it was mostly Peterson talking about why this book exists. Then at one point of explicit agreement, we have Rule 7, pursue what is meaningful, not what is expedient. If you're curious, the point of agreement was that life itself isn't evil. I'll note here that a lot of these agreement points would almost immediately be met with a disagreement point, either because of the general framing of the part that I agreed with, or because it would take a sharp 90-degree turn into something less good. An example of this was in Rule 12. I can get behind the general sentiment that we need to cherish our loved ones, but it was baked into this idea that you need to do that because of their fragility and limited time on Earth. Now moving up to 3rd place for points of agreement is, interestingly, the parenting chapter at 7 agreement points. My initial plan, as scripted, was to list off the points of agreement for these top 3, but it's redundant with what I talk about in the ranking later, so I will talk about it later, just not now. Tied for 2nd place with 8 points are Rules 10, be precise in your speech, and 11, don't bother skateboarding kids. The chapter I agreed with Peterson the most was apparently Rule 4. Compare yourself to who you were yesterday, not to who someone else is today. At 11 points of me overtly agreeing with what he was saying. Moving on. In the event you're curious, the smiley faces in the book can be found in Rules 2, 7, and 12. The last of the positives we'll talk about are the unintentional positives. These are things that brought me, and I think you guys, some joy, albeit not through Peterson's intent. The parenting chapter informed us of his burning hatred of Elmo. The Let Kids Skateboard chapter let us know that his nickname is Howdy. Howdy doody if you're nasty. And Petting Cats let us see his daughter's floofball, affectionately called Suck Dog by Peterson. In neutral territory, I scored the rule names themselves. And this is a combination of how usable the rule name is as a piece of advice, how much further explanation it would need in order for that rule to make sense, and how well it actually match the content of the chapter. I've got these as a neutral sort of thing because some of these pieces of advice I'm not really a fan of. But if it's actionable advice that doesn't need further explanation and matches what's in the chapter, it would have a reasonable score. I've pulled this out as its own thing because, let's be honest, sometimes these rule names are treated as fully representative of what's in the book, and hopefully by this point I've demonstrated that that isn't always the case. To give you an example of what I didn't think was a solid rule name, the lowest was Rule 6. Set your house in perfect order before you criticize the world. The ability to go out and apply this rule strictly from the title is pretty low. It's not an incredibly elegant title, and it isn't a great fit for the bulk of the chapter. The 4 and 3rd are Rules 2, treat yourself like someone you're responsible for helping. 3, make friends with people who want the best for you. 5, do not let your children do anything that makes you dislike them. And 10, be precise in your speech. Rule 2 has a pretty good surface level message, makes sense, but lost points because of the many tangents the chapter went through on the way to reaching the point. Rule 3 lost some points in the meh-ness of the advice of the rule and how well it actually matched the text. Rule 5 matched the text pretty well, but what exactly does it mean to not let your kids do anything that makes you dislike them? The implication is pretty grim, which does match the chapter. Rule 10 is pretty cut and dry, but given Peterson's apparent inability to follow his own advice, doesn't match the chapter for large stretches of text. Tied for second are Rules 4, compare yourself to who you were yesterday, not to who someone else is today, and 8, tell the truth, or at least don't lie. Rule 4 got docked for meandering from the core message a bit, and Rule 8 for excluding some of the nuance that we deal with when communicating with other people. Sometimes you have to lie, either for social lubrication or self-preservation. That's just how life is. In first place, I've got Rule 9. Assume that the person you're listening to might know something you don't. I thought this had pretty good direct utility, was sufficiently explained, and matched the contents of the chapter pretty well. Alrighty, on to the negatives. These are sort of reverse scored, kind of like golf. Ideally, you'd want to keep these scores as low as possible, but it's more fun to talk about which ones knock the metaphorical golf ball into the water hazard and then struggle to get it out. As such, the podium standers will be the ones who really struggle to get that ball out. Okay, starting with these citation needed flags. And to reiterate something I said earlier, the way I talked about this and handled it was a little different early on in the series, so those first couple chapters might have lower than they should be counts. Rounding out the bottom of the counts were the chapters where Peterson focused more on sharing personal stories or just fully embracing the style madness. The friendship chapter and Coda had 2 citation needed flags, the Not Quite Glass Houses chapter had 7, and Petting Cats had 9. Now looking at third place, we've got Rule 5, the parenting chapter, with 33 flags. In seconds, Rule 10, be precise in your speech, at 54. And the crowning achievement in me wondering where the sources are is the skateboarding chapter, Rule 11, with 126. But again, this chapter took 6 videos to get through, so we did spend a bit more time there. There was also a lot of what the fuckery going on in that chapter too, don't get me wrong. Speaking of, next up is a somewhat broad category. It includes things like during reading, if I let out an audible or had some other apparently involuntary bodily reaction like or just general what the fuckery. The lowest count of these was in the overture with 0, but I was a different person then. So naive and innocent and blissfully unaware of what was coming in the rest of the book. I don't know if it would have gotten 0 reactions from me at this point. Coming in third is Rule 7, pursue what is meaningful, not what is expedient, with 28 WTFs. This chapter had the emphasis on sacrifice and tons of Bible adventures. In Seconds, Rule 10, be precise in your speech with 35. A large part of this was driven by the ongoing narrative of the wife being cheated on by her husband, and the ensuing maybe, perhaps chain that implied that she was as culpable because of reasons like Freud or her not trying to have sex harder. Taking the what the fuck cake at 55 is Rule 11. Do not bother children when they're skateboarding. This chapter being the seeming kitchen sink of the book helped drive up the number, as lots of it elicited a "why is this even in the chapter?" reaction from me. Plus the whole emphasis on tradition and how we should maybe give ourselves a break on the pending environmental collapse. Now, let's talk about doom or nihilism spirals. If you're looking to avoid these altogether, the overture, Rule 9, listen to people, or Rule 1, stand up straight with your shoulders back, are where you need to be. And checking this and flipping back through Rule 1, there were some sort of spirals of poor posture leading to bad outcomes, but it wasn't the full-blown doom spirals that we see later in the book. In third, we've got the Pursue Meaning, Rule 7, and Precise Speech, Rule 10, chapters with 7 noted doom spirals each. Failing to pursue meaning was purported to leave you to the death camps of the last century, among other places. Some consequences of imprecise speech are the spirals into chaos that your car breaking down or your spouse cheating on you can lead to, in the latter case an insurmountable spiral. Or things will just fall apart altogether. Not bothering kids when they're skateboarding comes in second with 8 noted spirals. These spirals could come from environmental fervor, the loss of boys in higher ed, leading to educated women being completely unable to find assortative mating husbands, which will further divide the classes, or the threat of postmodern neo-Marxism in destabilizing society. The most spirally chapters, Rule 8, Tell the Truth, Bucko, with 10 spirals. These were things like being an inauthentic person, leading to destroying others, and going along with rationality, leading to totalitarians, or little lies leading to things like the Holocaust. Good times. Looking quickly at incidents of style madness, lest we succumb ourselves. The Overture and Rule 4, comparing yourself to other people, don't do that, were free of these. Jumping up to the third most incidents, we have a 3-way tie between Treating Yourself Better, Rule 2, Pursuing Meaning, Rule 7, and Skateboarding Kids, Rule 11, with roughly 6 excursions into word diarrhea. In second with 11, amusingly, is the Precise Speech chapter. Topping the list with 30 incidents is the coda. The question and answer thing was too much for me, so I counted those little bastards individually. To round out the quantifiable portion of this video, I'll just share some of the mosts for other categories I looked at. Rule 7, Pursue what is meaningful, not what is expedient, had the highest because Bible or tradition count at 16. The highest count of Peterson's 2-box problem appeared in Rule 10, Be precise in your speech. Things are perceived as useful or in the way. The cheated upon wife is either victim or co-conspirator. You're either talking carefully or carelessly, yada yada. Not surprising given the kitchen sink nature of the chapter, the rule about letting kids skateboard had the most about postmodern neo-Marxism and communism. Finally, the most Jung-ing happened in the Pursue Meaning chapter, while the most Freud-ing happened in the kids skateboarding chapter. So yeah, those were some of the general differences between chapters in the book. Now, let's get to ranking these bad boys. This ranking is mostly going to be going off of the solid messages I thought were in the chapter, with some wiggling happening based on the factors we talked about earlier in the video and how much I liked or disliked the chapter. Also, this is going to be based on what's in the text, not things that can be distilled out of or inferred from what's written. And you can kind of think of this as being curved. The best of the rules had 6 good pieces of advice, and some of those kind of overlapped with each other. And as much as it pains me as a former educator, I'm going to use the YouTube ranking standard that includes an S and an E. Starting at the beginning with the Overture. There's not really anything substantive to take from that chapter life advice-wise, so as far as useful chapter goes, F. Rule 1, stand up straight with your shoulders back. The messages I pulled from this chapter were a general implicit sense that you can grow as a person. The body's an important consideration in mental health, and missing sleep can mess with your body as well as your general well-being. And working on building your self-worth and self-esteem is something you should focus on if you aren't feeling great about yourself. But those messages were buried in things like dissolving lobster brains, the necessity of the dominance hierarchy, and the idea that good posture will lead to your life improving in all facets. Digging out the useful message from the surrounding, in my opinion, unnecessary text is going to be a recurring issue. Oh, rank it. Right. I'm going to put it in A. The messages weren't too bad, and the what the fuckery of the chapter, while distracting, didn't really pull down the messages too bad. Messages from Rule 2. Treat yourself like someone you're responsible for helping, or to basically be kinder to yourself. Look for the helpers when you're feeling down or stuck, and that you deserve respect. The muck included a whole bunch of biblical stuff, including that we aren't kinder to ourselves because we're fallen creatures out of the grace of God. A fair bit of order is this, chaos is that, blah blah blah, which didn't really serve the messages. The assertion that we treat everything as a personality, and the wonderful argument that we have two fundamental categories baked into our perception and cognition: male and female. That's it. Rule 2 is going in C. B. C. The overall reliance of the Bible for supporting his arguments is why C, but I kind of like the core message enough to put it up to B, but then there's the whole fundamental category thing that just underlies so much of the problematic thought that C. The messages from Rule 3, make friends with people who want the best for you, or to have friends who want the best for you. It's nice when they match up. And to challenge yourself to grow and improve. But that was in a lot of autobiographical stuff from Peterson that probably should have been trimmed down. There's also the general framing, from trying to help people only coming from selfish or narcissistic drives, to an emphasis on the transactional nature underlying relationships. That's a C from me, dog. Useful messages in Rule 4, compare yourself to who you were yesterday, not to who someone else is today, or a note that your inner critic can be overly critical. The idea that while you may not be good at everything, you're probably good at something. Focusing too much on success and failure may not be helpful. The suggestion to break apart large problems into manageable chunks, and, as the rule says, not to worry too much about comparing yourself to others. To get to these messages, you had to dig through a surprising amount of shit-talking the reader, which also influenced the overall negative framing. A tangent into visual perception and cognition that I don't think was accurately represented. Some doom spiraling, the idea that there's no such thing as an atheist, a lot of biblical filler, and the instructions to not think. I did have my problems with the chapter, but I think the central message wasn't too bogged down by them, so this is going in S. And I think the advice of not comparing yourself to others but to yourself is pretty worthwhile. It's a work in progress for me, certainly. The good takeaways from Rule 5, do not let your children do anything that makes you dislike them, were that parents need to be parents to their kids first, friends second, having a discipline plan in place before incidents happen, and that reinforcement and timeouts are useful techniques in the parenting toolbox. But there is a lot of things to not take from this chapter. So much so, these are going to be argued against as we go through them. Kids generally don't suck. Parents not parenting how Peterson deems fit also don't automatically suck. Tradition is not always the best way to do things, especially when that tradition involves beating your kids. Children do need discipline, but it's irresponsible to leave it rather open-ended to what exactly discipline means. Kids don't need to be put in their place by the adults in their lives. People don't automatically become all-knowing sages upon their 18th birthday. Physical discipline should be off the table, non-negotiable. And this isn't some crazy SJW idea. This is the medical and UN standard. Divorce isn't a social ill. Keeping two adults together in a relationship that isn't working isn't in the best interest of anyone, especially the kids. Honestly, this chapter. It was relative fun and games until we got to this chapter. As such, it's getting the first D, but it's closer to an E than a C. And so it's a fail, Not a total fail, because there were a couple good nuggets of advice in there, but don't hit your kids. The useful bits of advice from Rule 6, set your house in perfect order before you criticize the world, were general advice to work on improving your life. The idea that if you were abused when you were young, you aren't destined to repeat that when you're older, and that you don't have to adhere to some external arbitrary code of behavior. These were set against the whole school shooters and mass murderers landscape, more devil and Bible than you can shake a chaos snake at, doom and nihilism spirals aplenty, walking back the third bit of useful advice to say that you shouldn't really go off the cultural beaten path either, and the strong caution to not even think about trying to fix the world until your own shit is perfectly sorted. Plus, getting your shit sorted will somehow trickle up into fixing the world. I did not like this chapter on so many levels. D. And it really speaks to the other chapters that this is only going as low as a D. Case in point, Rule 7. Pursue what is meaningful, not what is expedient. The useful message, singular, directly from this is the idea that life itself isn't evil. This is weighed against a long, strong emphasis on sacrifice being a good, necessary thing, bunches of biblical stories to support the previous point, some sketchy cognitive, the whole Socrates thing, ending with Socrates taking his poison like a man, a lengthy discussion of the history of the Christian church, including Nietzsche declaring God's death. Nestled in that was a sort of attack on how most Christians are Christianing wrong, an emphasis on tradition and not rocking the cultural boat, and suffering being Peterson's unquestionable truth and building a life philosophy on top of that. Not exactly a strong chapter life advice-wise. E. Rule 8. Tell the truth, or at least don't lie. I don't think the rule title is that great of a message. However, this chapter did contain the nudge that if your current way of trying to solve a problem or fix something isn't working, to try a new approach, stating that psychological disorders aren't the fault of the person experiencing them, encouragement to work on building your character and figuring out your ethical positions, and an emphasis to live your truth. But, of course, here comes the less great parts. The somewhat baffling stories of his encounter in a psych ward, or the whole landlord situation, who would drunkenly sell Peterson appliances for cash and was described as prone to violence, among other things. Life or other lies leading to doom spirals, the idea that reason is bad, tradition is good, the caveat to living your truth, that it needs to not be ideologically driven, which people familiar with Peterson in the series can probably get the implication of, and the instruction to not lie, ever. Another chapter where the central messages pulled it out from the surrounding context. C. It passed. There aren't too many messages to pull from Rule 9. Assume that the person you're listening to knows something that you don't, but they're strong ones. Active listening is a very important conversational skill, and don't assume that you know everything there is to know. However, this chapter had the uncomfortably long story about his former client that may have been sexually assaulted, the assertion that true thinking is rare. As such, you need to outsource your thinking and sanity to others. Freud was correct because he's still hated. The almost comically lengthy categorization of the different types of conversation. And, of course, that you need to not go messing about with culture or tradition. I think exposing people to active listening is enough to bring this up into a B, but it's a low B. I'm torn on where to stick Rule 10. Be precise in your speech. Useful things from this chapter? Useful things from this chapter were primarily boundaries. Active listening is useful, but boundaries are important. Being able to effectively communicate what you are or aren't okay with to other people is a critical life skill. There's also the idea to focus arguments so that they're productive, a repeated emphasis on working on personal growth, and that our perception isn't an entirely faithful reproduction of the world. The not useful things included the whole shtick about the utility of laptops, corrupt governments, and you not perceiving your car until it breaks. A sojourn into tool use and categorization that I don't fully agree with. The general idea that perception falls apart in chaotic situations. The very long story about the wife who's cheated on by her husband, with all the perhapses and maybes that implied the blame may have been hers, and so much chaos dragon. Let's call it a B. I kind of want to stick it lower because of all of the diversions, but this chapter is the one where we really hammer into communicating boundaries, so saving grace. Useful messages from the kitchen sink chapter, Rule 11. Do not bother children when they're skateboarding. Safety comes from competence. Building skill takes challenge. Boundaries, again. And the educational system, as it is now, is failing to actually educate many boys. Then there's the not useful parts. According to Peterson, Orwell said that socialism's bad. The stories about his friend Chris that just... why? Peterson's apparent disgust for people suggesting that we try to reduce the number of kids we're having to try to reduce our impact on the environment. That environmentalism is bad and will lead to doom dealers. The entire postmodern neo-Marxism thing, and all of the ends of Western civilization as a consequence. Criticisms of the patriarchy are bad and ill-founded because some guys sometimes help women, and women quitting high-pressure jobs isn't because of anything we should really be concerned about. Communism bad, meritocracy and free market good. Gender is not a social construct. Boys need to be boys and separate from girls. Marriage is necessary, so younger adults not getting married is a huge concern. A bunch of Freud, Jung, and Oedipal or terrible mothers. And the final message that you need to toughen up, bucko. Ugh, I initially had this as a C, but then I started scripting things out and it became a solid E. The takeaways of Rule 12, pet a cat when you encounter one on the street, were remembering that life is short and fragile, so time with loved ones is important, and to try to not lose sight of the good in bad situations. These were sprinkled in a fair bit of history for his daughter's juvenile arthritis, the flip side of love, with Peterson settling on loving because of others' fragility, and some doom spirals and communism bad. The core message isn't bad, but between the framing and the large focus on Michaela's health history, let's call it a high C. Finally, the coda. The novel messages in this chapter were that taking a break in a heated argument can be useful, and to beware the enlightened ones. But to get to those, you had to go through the whole pen of light question and answer bullshit. Plus, the framing on the fight part was a bit Peterson-y. Yeah, I know it's a wrap-up chapter, but the useful advice to verbiage was pretty low. D. So yeah, there's my ranking for the chapters of 12 Rules. Just going from the ranks themselves, the book doesn't look half bad. But let us not forget the many philosophical, biblical, or research side journeys and style-mad passages that had to be dug through to get to that advice. I've offhandedly called it distilling before, and I think that metaphor is apt. Boil off the toxic stuff first before you can get to the useful bits. That won't turn you blind. Time for one last traditional wrap-up. Pull out the useful life messages from the book, or more likely, supplement them with our own. Let's start with something I didn't repeat often enough throughout the series. No advice is going to be one size fits all. If Peterson's advice works for you, great. If the things I'm saying in response to Peterson work for you, cool. If they don't, that's okay too. Keep trying things until you find something that does work for you. First, learn to value and love yourself for your strengths and your weaknesses. Imposter syndrome is a real thing, and faking it until you make it can work, but also don't feel like you have to not be yourself or fake it when you actually need help in something. Asking for help is okay. You should care for yourself as others who care about you would. Not because we're all fallen and broken creatures out of the grace of God, but because you are worthy of care and love. Relationships with others shouldn't always be a negative experience. If you consistently leave encounters with a friend or loved one feeling worse than when you went into it, it might be time to reevaluate their place in your life. Maybe all you need to do is establish and maintain some boundaries with them. If that doesn't work or isn't enough, no one is entitled to your time or love. Primarily compare yourself against yourself. And it's okay to check in with other people and see how you compare against them, but don't let that become your focus. You don't have any control over their lives, and you don't know what their situation is for why they're doing better or worse than you, so it's only really productive to focus on your own. Also, getting frustrated is okay. It just might mean that something is above your current skill level, and that's fine. That just means you need to keep working at it, and it's part of learning. Don't hit your kids. Seriously. Reinforcement should be your primary method. And if you're reaching a point where you feel like you might lose it, you can take a time out too. Life can be hard and seemingly cruel. You don't have to match it. Try spreading light and love, and you may make the world a little bit less awful. You can find contentment, maybe even happiness, in lots of places. Maybe it will be from meaningful pursuits, maybe not. Keep trying until you find your bliss. Honesty may be a good general policy, but it's also important to know when to not be. Active listening is a useful skill to build and employ, especially when talking to someone with a novel or opposing view. Boundaries. You need to be able to tell others what is or is not okay for you. It's also important to know when your boundaries are being pushed or crossed, and that you don't have to tolerate that sort of behavior. Some people may respond to being corrected, and that's fine, that's great. If someone disregards or ignores your boundaries, refer back to Rule 3. Working on building your skills through challenging activities is good, but please remember that failure is a part of getting better at something, and also to mitigate the risk where you can. Love because you love someone, not because you might lose them, and remember that time with them is precious. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, never lend Peterson a novelty pen. To close out this series, I'm going to go back to a quote I used earlier in the series from a wise philosopher, Patton Oswalt. Life is chaos. Be kind.